Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Emmanuelle Maitre. I'm a research fellow at the Fondation for Strategic Research, a think tank in Paris, which is especially working on security issues. I'm delighted to open this webinar, which is dedicated to the topic of strategic risk reduction within the P5 process. As you may know, France is currently chairing the P5 process. This presidency started a little bit in a challenging way, of course, as everybody was trying to adapt to the pandemic. And of course, we had a lot of uncertainty about how and when we could have the review conference, which was scheduled for 2020. We hope now that this RefCon will be able to take place in January 2022, and that the P5 principles meeting will also be able to be organized in Paris in December. Physical meetings have been able to resume at the expert levels of the P5, so that's of course an important point. In this context, the Foundation for Strategic Research, FRS, has been tasked with supporting the French presidency of the P5 and bringing a civil society perspective on this process. We have been organizing a series of webinars which are open and which are meant, of course, to create opportunities for exchanges between P5 representatives and civil society, but also to bring transparency on this process. We are sponsoring the publication of pieces on these issues, and we will be in charge of organizing a track 1.5 meeting in the margins of the principal conference. Today's webinar is so part of this series. It's going to tackle a very important topic for the P5, which is the question of strategic risk reduction. Indeed, it's one of the work stream for the group, and it's a topic that has received increasing attention in recent years. To evoke this topic, I'm delighted to have three experts of the matter. First, we will hear Bisha Shetty, who is the Executive Director of the Asia Pacific Leadership Network. Previously, she served as Deputy Director of the European Leadership Network, which she co-founded in 2011. During her years at ULN, Bisha followed the P5 process very closely, as the European Leadership Network was commissioned in partnership with another institute to support the UK presidency of the P5. Then we will hear Dr. Wilfred Wan, who is lead research in WMD program at UNIDIR. Dr. Wan has published extensively on this issue as well, especially a study which can be seen, I think, as a reference on the matter, and which is called Nuclear Weapon Risk Reduction, a Framework for Analysis, and its follow-up, Nuclear Weapon Risk Reduction, the State of Ideas. Finally, we will have Anastasia Maligina, who is Associate Professor at the School of International Relations in St. Petersburg University. Dr. Maligina is an expert on the Non-Proliferation Treaty and its review process, arms control in general, as well as strategic stability. Before I give the floor to our experts, I will remind you that this conversation, this webinar, is being recorded and it will be available on our website in a few days. Of course, we will also have time at the end of the presentations for an exchange between the panelists and the audience. So please feel free to send your questions or comments in the chat box or in the Q&A box as we go along. With this, we are going to start right away, and I'm happy to give the floor to Bisha Shetty. Shata, please.
Thank you, Emmanuelle. Good afternoon, everyone, and good evening to those of you in my part of the world, which is Australia. Thank you to FRS for organising this event and for inviting me to speak. As Emmanuelle mentioned, in 2019 and 2020, while I was still deputy at the European Leadership Network, we worked in collaboration with Heather Williams and her team at King's College London to conduct a project on the P5 process supported by the UK Foreign Office. So at that time, we held a series of workshops with experts and officials, published a policy memo as well as a report, and conducted the civil society events on the sidelines of the London P5 conference that year. Our intention for that project was to interrogate the P5 process, examining its successes and limitations, and assessing how this initiative can positively contribute to a successful P5 London conference and the NPT RevCon. So in my remarks today, I will share with you some of our insights from that experience, briefly discuss how the P5 has progressed, most notably from 2018 onwards, offer some highlights from last year's P5 London conference, and how strategic risk reduction has emerged as an important issue. So as we all know, the P5 process was established to improve cooperation and confidence building between the nuclear weapon states to make progress on Article 6. The process created for the first time a platform for the nuclear weapon states to collectively discuss and progress their unique obligations outside of the formalized traditional NPT frameworks. Since then, the P5 process has had mixed success since it was established in 2009. In process terms, the group has met regularly. Since then, they've held formal conferences every year except for 2017 and 2018, around about the time of the Salisbury chemical weapons incident in the UK, which naturally soured relations. However, despite not having what should have been a formal P5 conference in 2017 and 2018, China assumed the role of coordinator in July 2018 and convened a number of P5 consultations and meetings in Geneva and New York before hosting a formal P5 conference in Beijing in January 2019. At that conference, for the very first time, the P5 agreed on a 5-point work plan in an attempt to try and make a substantive contribution to the RevCon, which was expected to happen the following year. Since then, with the UK taking over the coordinator role and then handing over to France more recently, the P5 have focused on developing the Glossary of Nuclear Terms 2.0, led by China, discussions on nuclear doctrines, led by the UK, strategic risk reduction and FMCT, led by France, peaceful nuclear uses, and the Bangkok Treaty. In terms of progress, at the London P5 conference last February, during the main civil society plenary, each P5 delegate spoke to an issue relevant to their internal P5 discussions. France discussed strategic risk reduction, Russia spoke about doctrines, the UK talked to transparency, China reported on progress within the P5 and prospects for RevCon 2020, and the US focused on RevCon 2025. In terms of P5 achievements and outputs, China announced that version 2 of the glossary of key nuclear terms had been agreed and will be presented at the next RevCon. We learned that the P5 would hold a joint side event on nuclear doctrines and another one on peaceful uses of nuclear technology. They also agreed to issue a joint statement on the peaceful use of nuclear energy at RevCon and to continue to submit their national reports. We also later learned that during the P5 closed-door deliberations, they agreed to continue work on nuclear doctrines and strategic risk reduction beyond RevCon, recognizing the importance of these issues for the next review cycle. Many of the key points on doctrines, emerging technologies, and strategic risk reduction that were raised during last year's P5 conference are relevant to our current discussion today. At last year's event, Russia informed participants that the issue of nuclear doctrines had been on the P5 agenda from the very beginning of the P5 process, but from 2019 became more structured and they hoped more regular. They considered the doctrines discussion a risk reduction measure, which could help with easing of tensions between the P5 as the dialogue provides an opportunity to raise concerns and to address misunderstandings on doctrinal issues. They felt it was a good addition to the bilateral track and mentioned that it is important that this dialogue is conducted with the involvement from military experts. And overall, the discussions on doctrine had revealed differences amongst the P5, some of which were significant, including where a country's view of its own doctrine clashed with the views of other P5 states. Russia also noted that there were some tensions between the competing aims of transparency, of maintaining acceptable levels of ambiguity for deterrence purposes, and ensuring that national security is not compromised. However, it very much depended on the approach, and different approaches could offer acceptable levels of transparency and acceptable levels of ambiguity that wouldn't go against national security interests. They expressed openness to extending the dialogue on doctrines to include new technologies, but did stress that significant progress was unlikely in the multilateral track without progress on the bilateral level with the US, and keeping in mind that this was in February 2020. China described the P5 process efforts as promoting strategic trust and informed the attendees that the doctrinal dialogue will be a permanent item on the P5 agenda. China also referred to a joint statement by the P5 during the 2000 Review Conference on the de-targeting of nuclear weapons. At that time, all 5 nuclear weapons declared that, and I quote, "None of our nuclear weapons are targeted at any state," end quote. This statement was not included in the 2010 RevCon final consensus document, and it's interesting that China mentioned it last year. And to make it clear, this suggestion wasn't agreed by the P5, but rather came exclusively from China. They said that in their view, it could be useful to reiterate or reissue some form of joint statement along those lines during the next review conference. They also pointed to the lack of rules regulating emerging technologies and their impact on strategic stability, and expressed support for useful discussions to that end to support a successful RevCon. Looking specifically at strategic risk reduction, France had led at that point the strategic risk reduction workstream. Based on the breakout group discussions with civil society that they had earlier in the day, they posited that a definition of strategic risk reduction is needed. They argued that in the context of P5 discussions, addressing the concept requires a fairly rigorous approach because it is referred to in different ways and in ways in which not all P5 states recognize as risk reduction. They use the example of unauthorized use, which is typically about weapons security, and unintended use, which could be more about accidents or technical error. And they made the case that what should be discussed should focus on the intended use of nuclear weapons, but based on perhaps incorrect assumptions or misperceptions. So how can that be best managed? They argued that was most conducive to potential progress, but it's, like all of these issues, complicated. It has many layers, and they're trying to discuss this as part of the P5 process and in the P5 context. They also mentioned the importance of escalation management and crisis communication mechanisms, and identifying both escalating and stabilizing factors in crisis. And they reported that within the P5 context, they're looking at existing channels, arrangements, mechanisms between the P5, and stress that they're keen to continue to lead the work on that effort. They did, however, caution that it is difficult to have a very specific conversation about these issues in the multilateral fora, and that it's much easier in bilateral or perhaps trilateral tracks. So overall, progress seems to have been, reasonable progress seems to have been made within the P5 process on their work plans, although there are clear points of tension ahead of the review conference. Although there is certainly a willingness to undertake efforts to make sure that RevCon is a success. Finally, in our joint project between ELN and KCL last year, we recommended in December 2019 that the P5 should establish a working group on strategic risk reduction and crisis stability for the next NPT review cycle, and announce this at RevCon. The working group could address questions including what actions, deployments, or behaviors could lead to misunderstandings or miscalculations that could trigger or exacerbate a crisis? What are the implications for strategic stability of various kinds of systems, non-nuclear, nuclear, novel? And what do the P5 regard as the principal threats to strategic stability today? And one of the main and really very simple conclusions from our project was that with respect to strategic risk reduction is that states view it very differently. There's no one agreed definition. There must be a better shared understanding on what strategic risk reduction means, and with that in mind, which measures are most viable, politically and practically, and most suitable to addressing the challenge. Also, on a more concrete level, the P5 should share with the non-nuclear weapon states existing agreements that they have in place that relate to risk reduction. So, for instance, on alert status, missile launch notifications, functioning or defunct agreements even. They should be clearly explained, and not only would this increase transparency, but would also help to identify gaps on where more could be done. And last but not least, and this has been stressed by both non-nuclear weapon states and acknowledged by the P5 a number of times, but it's worth re-emphasizing, risk reduction is not a replacement and should not deviate from disarmament. Rather, pursuing risk reduction can and should be done in parallel and support disarmament efforts. And with that, I will stop there and allow for the other presenters. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shatapisha. It was very clear, very useful to remind the position of key countries in this process and to assess what you have seen as progresses, but also some of the difficulties ahead. You mentioned the problem or the difficulty of actually having a shared concept and a shared view of what is strategic risk reduction. Wilfred, that's something that you've been looking at quite closely. So I think you can also give your perspective on this.
Thank you, Emmanuelle. And thanks to FRS for extending the invitation. I'm quite appreciative of the opportunity today. I should mention the views expressed today are my own. So Unitier has been and continues to do research around the topic of nuclear risk reduction. And I think what's striking to me is one, how much the topic has evolved over the course of this NPT review cycle, and two, the largely constructive nature of discussions. And it really speaks to the efforts of states across different venues, including the CEND initiative, as well as the Stockholm initiative, the latter of which issued a working paper on a nuclear risk reduction package that's well worth reading, among others. But I've been asked today to consider strategic risk reduction efforts between P5 members, how it's evolved in recent years, and what main fields of work remain necessary in the immediate future. So let me start by observing or reiterating what Shata said, which is that the concept of strategic risk reduction is fairly narrow in scope. And it focuses on reducing the risk of unintentional nuclear war. These are risks that are linked to interactions between adversarial nuclear weapon possessors and to the conflict dynamics between them, as defined and outlined in an IFRI paper earlier this year. These are risks that center on misinterpretation, misunderstanding, and miscalculation of strategic intentions, capabilities, and actions, especially in crisis situations. I think it's important to underline this constitutes just one particular risk pathway, what some might call inadvertent escalation. Now, there exists a diverse set of measures to address this possibility. And a lot of this stems from the Cold War, following mutual concerns from the United States and the then Soviet Union. I won't linger too much here, but the activities encompass a few categories. One is a set of confidence and security building measures that facilitate greater transparency around or promote restraints in or to avoid certain military activities. The second, of course, is the arms control treaties and frameworks to restrict capabilities or their deployments to head off technological or arms racing, and in the process, create more predictability in the relations among states. Third, and related to that, is the long run-up to these treaties, SALT and START in particular, entailed a series of conferences, negotiations, and summits in which these states also discussed broader strategic concerns. Now, this specific phrase of strategic risk reduction was introduced, I think, in 2019 in the Group of 7 and has been incorporated into the P5 process, as Shata outlined. In talking about this, the P5 generally focus on the importance of these deliberative processes, of the work that they're doing towards building common understandings, restoring trust, and creating more transparency. And Emmanuelle, you actually highlighted this in an ELN piece, but at a minimum, having a work plan and focus on these issues forces these states to address them on a regular basis, including through consultations on nuclear doctrines and policies. And looking back at the establishment of the P5 process itself, you could argue that the regular dialogue has facilitated a bit more transparency, including the development of a common reporting mechanism around NPT obligations, and subsequently improving information sharing about arsenals, as in the case of France. And whether because of the P5 structure or not, a significant positive step around strategic risk reduction quite recently is the ongoing Russia-US bilateral strategic stability dialogue. But in terms of recommendations moving forward, I would outline two kind of broad categories of actions. One is for states to sustain strategic engagement where exists while exploring the possibility for their extension or their expansion. As mentioned, the P5 has agreed to continue discussions of strategic risk reduction into the next cycle. And it'll be interesting to see whether there are potential deliverables following the meeting that is being coordinated by France or at the NPT Review Conference itself. There's potential, for instance, for a joint statement or a joint common commitment to risk reduction, perhaps a more concrete blueprint or timeline for actions. But the continuation of the process also allows an opportunity for states to delve further in terms of their doctrines and policies, perhaps eventually allowing an exploration of how these states link their policies and their doctrines to capabilities, to modernization plans, and to the development of particular systems of concern. There are, of course, constraints to the P5 format, and this highlights the importance of fostering bilateral strategic stability dialogues. Russia and the US have talked about the exploration of arms control and risk reduction measures. Regular talks between China and the US, including on strategic stability, would be quite valuable as well. And some have also brought up the idea of trilateral or plurilateral discussions as well. Such exchanges can help to address emerging uncertainties and chip away at the strategic unpredictability that exists. And this is especially relevant as technological developments threaten to upend the strategic environment further. These meetings can also allow a discussion of specific systems of concern in those relations, for instance, missile defense, low yield warheads, and so forth, and increase potentially transparency around them. But there's also value of other configurations of states to consider doctrine and broader strategic threat perceptions, including nuclear armed states outside the NPT. And I saw somebody actually already brought this up in the chat already. But there's also, in addition to this, value in the P5 to engage non-nuclear weapon states in a regularized manner beyond briefings that have taken place, notably to the NPDI. I think there's an overall recognition that the current environment provides obvious challenges to reducing stockpiles themselves. It requires a level of trust among nuclear armed states that's currently not in place. But these kind of strategic discussions can hopefully build that trust, provide the contours for future agreements, and in the meantime, locate areas where common ground is possible. And on that, the second kind of broad category of action that I would recommend is for states to account for relevant contexts for escalation possibilities linked to strategic risks, including beyond nuclear domains. And so one means to do this is to strengthen conflict prevention and management tools, which target military behaviors and activities that can be seen as provocative. They can do this by revisiting hotlines, incidents at sea accords, the prevention of dangerous military activities agreements, or as is more prevalent in the East Asia case, memorandums of understanding on air and maritime behaviors. This can be done at the level of the individual arrangement. For instance, the UK and Russia recently updated their INCSI, as did Norway and Russia, to specify distances between vessels to account for new systems, to establish new procedures. There are other ways that they can improve these arrangements, for instance, by conducting more joint exercises to practice the use of signaling. Some have recommended the consideration of a NATO-Russia agreement or other regional or sub-regional frameworks, or they can expand the provisions that do exist in terms of information exchange. But another approach is perhaps to have a wider conversation given technological developments that are impacting operations and capabilities, that are altering the spectrum of destabilizing activities to include newer, more prominent capabilities. Some examples here would be kind of the increased frequency of submarine operations, as well as the deployment of autonomous underwater vehicles. And for the most part, submerged operations aren't included in some of these agreements I mentioned. Lasers are, for instance, but there can be a discussion about the increasing integration of non-kinetic capabilities, including directed energy weapons, into existing platforms. And perhaps there's also a need for conversation about the involvement of non-military vessels, including law enforcement vessels. So there may be a need to reorient agreements around the characteristics of vessels, aircraft, et cetera, that are involved in these exercises, in these activities, which is kind of a parallel to calls for innovation in arms control as well. And this is in order to reflect, I think, the increased activity and exercises given the age of some of these agreements. Existing gaps in coverage can feed into misperceptions and misunderstanding and really drive the possibility of inadvertent escalation, which is at the heart of strategic risk reduction. And so strategic dialogues and some of these existing consultative mechanisms in these agreements can be a means to ease into some of these conversations. So I'll conclude by saying that there's a lot of work to be done, even within the more narrow confines of the strategic risk reduction concept. And with that, I'll stop here and I look forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Wilfred, for giving us a very clear understanding of what is meant and how this notion of strategic risk reduction has evolved. Also for giving these different perspectives for the future in areas where progresses can be made. As you noticed, we already have questions and comments. Please, once again, feel free to send those, as we are going to have some time to revisit these issues and go deeper on some of the subjects. I'm now happy to give the floor to Anastasia Malugina, who is going to particularly focus her first presentation on how all this discussion is also put into the context of the NPT review cycle and the REFCON that may happen next year. Anastasia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Emmanuelle. I'd like to thank the Foundation for Strategic Research for their kind invitation to participate in this important discussion. And I should mention that the views I'm expressing today are on my own. I will start with most likely developments, then I will observe the possible roadblocks on the way forward, and I will end up with some speculations about the value of the P5 strategic risk reduction efforts for the success of the NPT Review Conference. The P5 share a common concern. The threat of nuclear war is real. Moreover, the P5 share a common understanding that dialogue and consultations may increase mutual trust and help avoid misunderstandings and miscalculations leading to unacceptable consequences. That is a promising beginning, I believe. And the P5 states have all chances to move forward at two levels. Firstly, the P5 may make one or several symbolic steps. For instance, President Putin proposed that the P5 convened at the P5 summit. Such a summit may be a chance to demonstrate goodwill and reaffirm commonly shared principles and norms. The other option may be a joint statement or a chain of identical unilateral statements which will communicate to the foreign and domestic audiences that the political leaders of the P5 states understand their responsibility to sustain peace, prevent a nuclear arms race, and avoid nuclear war. Nuclear war must never be fought, and the decision makers must keep talking to each other to avoid miscalculations that may lead to devastating consequences. That is a commonly shared principle which people in all corners of the world need to hear. Secondly, the experts from the P5 states need to discuss all factors which may increase strategic risks. The dialogue on strategic stability has been relaunched and currently continues between the US and Russia. However, the concerns and terms adopted in the frames of this dialogue are not operational for the UK, France, or China. So there is a need to continue developing the language and glossary of terms commonly shared by the P5 and apply this language for conceptualizing the strategic risks and discussing further practical solutions to reduce strategic risks. The P5 need to discuss their nuclear doctrines, their security concerns, and their red lines. Maybe it will be reasonable to launch such discussions in various combinations of participants. For instance, not only on bilateral levels like US-China or US-Russia, but in Troika at a trilateral level of combinations UK, France, and Russia, or UK, France, and China, for instance. In the public space, the official representatives of China, France, Russia, the UK, and the US, I guess, will continue exchanging tough statements. When the trust is low, the tensions are high, and the security issues are complex, it is very difficult for decision makers to demonstrate readiness for compromises publicly. Domestic political life has its own inertia, and it is a risky endeavor for a politician to treat non-confrontationally someone labeled as a systemic competitor or acute and direct threat. Behaving cooperatively, a political leader risks looking weak in the voters' eyes, or even as someone who betrays fundamental national principles or values. So I believe the most productive way of conducting and sustaining strategic risk reduction dialogue between the P5 will be track 2 or track 1.5 consultations held behind closed doors. The dialogue, which demands a very detailed, delicate, and inclusive discussion on sensitive issues, will move slowly and not publicly. However, if the expert community can serve as a system integrator that facilitates the communication between the governmental officials, expert dialogue may result in visible and sustainable outcomes. At the next stage, the P5 may make statements about the non-deployment of nuclear weapons in some regions. After that, they may introduce multilateral confidence-building measures. And at the next stage, they have good chances to develop and introduce measures for monitoring and verifying compliance with non-deployment restrictions. Of course, all those steps will require time, political support, and long-lasting trustful relations based on a commonly shared vision of strategic risks. So the first issue to fix is the lack of trust and sustainable dialogue. Now, what are the possible roadblocks? I would suggest to look at 4 types of challenges. The first is the factor of eternal competition between different domestic agenda items that require political attention. The goal of reducing strategic risks may stay in the shadow of other tasks that may seem to be more urgent and critical in a short-term perspective. If that is the case, the P5 strategic risk reduction dialogue may suffer the lack of political support and intellectual investments. The second challenge is that the decision makers may opt for unilateral zero-sum game strategies instead of integrative and cooperative approaches, which may prevent the P5 from constructing long-term trustful relations. The third challenge is unequal integration of national expert networks in the dialogue on strategic risk reduction. For instance, not many experts from France or China are visible in the nuclear arms control community landscape. A multi-level expert dialogue addressing all factors that increase strategic risks will demand a qualitatively new level of networking between national expert communities. The fourth challenge is the heterogeneous nature of the P5 in terms of the members' geopolitical status and national security concerns. The increasing intensity of great power competition speeds up the appearance of defense cooperation networks in the regions of tough geopolitical confrontations. That trend will sharpen the difference of concerns and expectations among the P5. Feeling oneself as a besieged fortress ruins appetite for building trust and transparency. So all members of the P5 need to exercise strategic empathy, which means taking into consideration the perceptions, concerns, intentions, and capabilities of the other side. The lack of strategic empathy may result in a deadlock in the P5 dialogue. Moreover, the geopolitical heterogeneousness of the P5 members determines the scope of options for a plausible multilateral accord. The P5 may develop and adopt fundamental principles, which will be a foundation for further bilateral or multilateral discussions in different combinations of regional security tracts. So P5 may construct the network of discussion hubs for sustainable expert dialogue on strategic risk reduction. Now let me address the future of the NPT review process. The P5 need to get together to discuss their nuclear postures. It's obvious, and my colleagues and friends have already mentioned that. In terms of strengthening the NPT, that is critical because the P5 need to clarify what they will undertake to continue fulfilling their obligations under the Article 6 of the NPT. Security assurances play a critical role in strengthening the NPT regime. And the P5 should reaffirm their commitment to existing security assurances regarding the use or threat of use of nuclear weapons. Moreover, they may wish to explore ways of cooperative adaptation of their nuclear postures towards a no first use principle. In the joint statement at the NPT Review Conference in 2015, the P5 reaffirmed that they remain ready to sign the protocol to the Treaty on the Southeast Asia Nuclear Weapon-Free Zone. That would be good if the P5 facilitate the constructive dialogue among the states parties to Southeast Asia nuclear weapon-free zone to find solutions to outstanding issues and overcome the obstacles preventing the P5 from signing the protocol. And last but not least, states parties to the NPT, including the P5, agreed to achieve the discontinuance of all test explosions of nuclear weapons for all time. That is how this goal is described in the preamble to the NPT. That means CTBT must enter into force, and it would be good if the P5 reaffirmed their will to ratify the CTBT and undertake practical steps in this direction. Currently, the participants of international relations casually treat their commitments to formal and informal international agreements. Ratification P5 share a common principle that they take their obligations under the NPT seriously. I guess I'll stop it there. Thank you very much, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you very much once again for stressing the difficulties, the roadblocks, but also pointing to ways to make progress on some objectives, some more immediate ways. I have a few questions already that we can address. I will take the first batch. I also have points of my own, but I will start with addressing what has been pointed by Wilfred in the discussion. So questions also that Anastasia, you just mentioned, the role that no first use might play in reducing nuclear risks. That's the first question. Another one about the role of affirmation of the Reagan-Gorbachev joint statement as took place in Geneva, to what extent this is contributing, how important is it as a step in this dialogue. And we have also a question we can address now also on the question of confidence. And it is the gentleman from the audience is noting that greater confidence might seem for some actors as a net loss for national strategic interests. So if you have remarks or comments on this, I will suggest that Shata, you start with those, but first I will answer one of the one very practical and question, which was on the possibility to rewatch this webinar. It will be possible to rewatch it on the FRS website and YouTube channel in a few days. So that's I'm happy that it was raised like this. I can decide this. Shata, if you
on the point about no first use, I mean, and again, this is my personal opinion, but it would have, I think, for many in the non-nuclear weapon states and in the NPT community, a profound symbolic value and profound kind of implications for the review conference if we were to have, say, for instance, a global no first use kind of pledges from all of the nuclear armed states. I mean, of course, that would not be achievable in the short time frame we have before the review conference, but it certainly would be considered a positive step, certainly by non-nuclear weapon states and those in support of the TPNW, for instance. I would say a similar principle would apply for the Reagan-Gorbachev statement. Symbolically, it's a political commitment, and it signifies the intention to at least try and reduce tensions between the nuclear weapon states. You know, I welcome the leadership shown by Presidents Biden, President Putin, and similarly by President Xi, by affirming that principle. And I hope that that the UK and China will, the UK and France will follow suit. On the question, I think that Paul Schultz had put to us, I mean, this is a difficult question, but I would propose that this is why dialogue, such as the P5 process, is needed to try and address misunderstandings, to try and confront or discuss some of these more contentious issues and raise concerns if there are those. Yeah, and I'll leave it. I'll turn to the other speakers.
Thank you very much. Wilfred?
Sure, thanks, Emmanuelle, and thanks for the questions we're already seeing. On the question of kind of no first use and Reagan-Gorbachev, you know, these kind of belong in a category of actions to stigmatize and strengthen the normative taboo, right? To lessen the spectrum of conditions in which nuclear weapon use is considered. And Anastasia actually in her presentation highlighted a few others in this category. And certainly these are positive, and high level political attention to kind of risk reduction can help keep it on the agenda in the public eye and extend the conversation beyond this review cycle. But I guess I should also observe that these things don't stand on their own. And certainly even with a couple of no first use policies that exist, there's a healthy level of skepticism by other states expressed as to the veracity of these policies. And I think it really calls attention to the need for activities across the board, including in force postures, the modernization programs and so forth. And so that's what there are kind of limits to these political commitments, as positive a step as it would be. On the question about engagement, I think with non-nuclear weapon states, I think was the question that was posed. Strategic risk is not limited to interactions between the P5. As mentioned, misunderstandings, miscalculation, misperceptions are possible in different regional theaters due to non-nuclear activities and due to developments in technologies and across domains in which an increasing number of states are engaged. And so it creates incentive to address these types of strategic risks that can get to the level of nuclear use. And so, certainly as the P5 process moves forward, that's something that I would hope to see to have that kind of more systematic engagement with a nuclear allied and non-nuclear weapon states. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you. Anastasia, you already mentioned the question of no first use. Do you want to add anything, and maybe also consider the question on whether or not confidence can always be seen as contributing to strategic interests?
Emmanuelle, could you please repeat the second part of your question, because I'm not sure I have caught it correctly.
Yes, sure. It was the question that Paul Schulte was sending our way, whether greater international confidence might always be seen as emphasizing national strategic interests, or if it might sometimes not be the case. And there was also the Reagan-Gorbachev question, how important that is for the process and in the view of the upcoming RevCon.
I have already mentioned the importance of Reagan-Gorbachev pledge, this formula that was reaffirmed by joint bilateral statement of the presidents of Russia and the US. And I see that the Chinese political leader is sharing this same approach and the same attitude, and made corresponding statements. So yeah, it's up to the United Kingdom and France to clarify their attitude and pledge and demonstrate the support and sharing of this principle. I do not see any obstacles for them to do that, and I believe that it will contribute to clarifying the principles of the P5 about the exclusive responsibility for sustaining peace and preventing nuclear war. As for no first use, I guess we should not have very high expectations about changes in this regard in the foreseeable future. But that does not mean that P5 must not move in this direction. So I think that there are chances, very good chances, for continuing discussing the nuclear doctrines, the role of nuclear weapons for national security, which may lead to clarification of the formula and adaptation of this formula to the current strategic environment. And then the P5, I guess, may be ready to pronounce it publicly. So I believe that the role of civil society may be sustaining this interest and appetite for these discussions, and put reasonable political pressure on their national authorities to continue searching for compromise, because that's not an easy task, and we must take into consideration the inertia of bureaucratic process in each of the governments, national governments. For instance, the American new nuclear posture review is not ready yet, and we do not know when we will be able to familiarize ourselves publicly with this document. So that is another obstacle, an objective obstacle. So I do not think that we should put very high expectations, which may lead to very deep regrets and dissatisfaction. So that's here I would keep balance between dreams and values and realistic assessment of the political environment. And the last thing, I guess it was about trust, if I understand the question correctly. I truly believe that if the politicians have appetite and will, there will be good practical solutions grounded in effective, sustainable technical approaches and technical solutions. So it will be not enough to set the limits or restrict something like using a technocratic approach. Everything is about trust and perception and miscalculation, which has this significant element of way of thinking, way of perceiving, and I mentioned the strategic empathy, that I guess that is the quality and the skill which may be lost among the current generation of political leaders. I'm afraid that they do not have this experience of taking responsible decisions which may lead to long-term consequences, and making the experience of making decisions in a tough, complicated strategic situation, that is a challenging task. The leaders of the Cold War had these first-hand experience of Cuban Missile Crisis, and the new generations of political leaders may lose this skill of sustaining strategic empathy and sustaining the ability for self-restraint and cautious behavior. Thank you. I guess that's all.
Thank you very much. The focus we had in this first round of questions on Reagan-Gorbachev no first use was making me think about how this whole process and this whole conversation on risk reduction could be seen in two ways. The first one is to, as was mentioned, try to bring deliverables to the REFCON, and in the context of the NPT review cycle, try to answer some of the requests and expectations that are made by non-nuclear weapon states or civil society. But as Shatabisha mentioned, some of these steps might be seen as more symbolic. In that case, if they are made just in this with this approach and just as a gesture of goodwill. Of course, another approach and another focus could be, as was also mentioned earlier, to really focus on the elements of risks and try to work maybe behind closed door on these, and to try to find answers and progresses. It might not sell as well in the REFCON context, but might be more useful to actually address those risks. So these two tracks are important on their own ways. To what extent do you feel that at the moment the P5 is more focusing on one or the other, and how both can be addressed without kind of contradicting each other would be, I think, an interesting point. And there was also a question which is a little bit related to that on the role of non-nuclear weapon states. It was mentioned that so far they've been associated, but maybe not as much as they should or as well as they should. And another issue I wanted to bring is the complementarity of the P5 process with other processes that are integrating non-nuclear weapon states and also working on nuclear or strategic risk reduction, such as CEND or Stockholm Initiative. So maybe we could address those two issues, the role of non-nuclear weapon states and whether or not the P5 is actually focusing on REFCON perspective or more a kind of deep and maybe more closed perspective to address the risks they are seeing as essential. Shata, you want to start?
Yes, of course, I'm happy to. So I think you raise an important point, Emmanuelle. I think ultimately there's limited resources when you're looking at P5 states and the people behind these deliberations and dialogues and consultations. There's limited capacity to manage all of the various tasks set to them. So in the absence of concrete disarmament, and let's be frank, there is no disarmament at the moment, there's a strong push for pursuing risk reduction measures, but then equally there's also a push from many in the NGO community for what we were discussing before, for the Reagan-Gorbachev reaffirmation of the principle. The assumption, and this is my assumption, and I'm just putting it out here to yourselves and to everyone in the chat here. The assumption is that the Reagan-Gorbachev reaffirmation shouldn't take significant amounts of man and woman hours to agree, but my understanding is that it is, and therefore less time is frankly available to spend on looking deeply at these risk reduction measures. And this is something that I would be interested to see when the P5 summit takes place, and the French leadership on this issue, how much has actually been achieved, how many of the recommendations which have been put forward by Wilfred and the many other organizations in our field in terms of practical measures that could be adopted or at least explored by the P5. How much of this is actually penetrating in capitals and being considered in these discussions that the P5 are having? Is it a case of limited time, or is it a case of they're not hitting the mark? This is something that I would be interested to hear from officials in their workings in the P5 process. And I think on your other point, Emmanuelle, on the kind of complementarity with other initiatives and engagement with non-nuclear weapon states, that's a point that Paul Ingram, I see, is raised in the chat. It's challenging to involve non-nuclear weapon states in trying to promote disarmament when it really has to be done by the nuclear weapon states themselves. But there have been a number of really important and significant initiatives that non-nuclear weapon states have been leading on, including NPDI, of course, the Stockholm Initiative, there's efforts in GGEs, and there's the CAND process, and all of these types of engagements and fora have, as I understand it, are being taken seriously by the nuclear weapon states, and through these different types of initiatives, which will, I hope, continue beyond RevCon, we will start to see some kind of pressure to the nuclear weapon states and continual engagement through these forums.
Thank you very much. Wilfred, you can also maybe comment on this role of the nuclear non-weapon states you started to mention. William Alberg is also commenting that we can start looking at risk reduction regardless of the status of states, mentioning that in the NPT there is a common obligation for all states to contribute to risk reduction. So this is of course something interesting, but at the same time we need to reconcile it with the fact that if we are within the P5 and if this topic is addressed by the P5, there will be mechanically nuclear weapon state focus, especially, but still it's of course a very important point. What's your take?
Thanks, Emmanuelle. There's quite a lot there, so I'll just try to make some comments that cover a couple of these topics, hopefully. Just let me start with the observation. I think the reason there's so much attention on risk reduction and strategic risk reduction is because of this kind of upcoming review conference and the concerns about the state of disarmament and things like this. I think it's important to have these processes to demonstrate a commitment or recommitment to reducing the risk of nuclear weapon use, to start kind of perusing perhaps a common language around some of these topics, and eventually, hopefully, to develop a blueprint for moving forward, to see kind of what is feasible in these different circumstances, these different contexts, these different regions, and so forth. But I think it's important to underline that I see this, or I hope that this is really just the first step, right, to kind of a dedicated action towards risk reduction moving forward beyond this review cycle and outside the NPT. And I think that's important to stress too. And this is, something that I've written about, which is the need for a dedicated risk reduction forum or discussion outside the auspices of the NPT. So I do want to say that. I mean, to the point about involving non-nuclear weapon states, yeah, I addressed that in my last answer. And I apologize because I think I actually mixed the Pauls during the Q&A. So I was addressing Paul Ingram's question about nuclear weapon states engagement and non-nuclear weapon state engagement. But this is actually quite relevant to the point that Paul Schulte brought up too, which is it is true that there is kind of an incentivization of risk and tension for certain states, right? And that's why when we talk about things like transparency and ambiguity, there's always going to be a balance that it has to be struck, and these are decisions made by states, themselves. But I think there are also certain unacceptable risks that there's kind of a, if you want to call it low-hanging fruit, you want to call it lowest common denominator or whatever, but like demonstrated in the Cold War, in the kind of aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis, about these kind of accidents. And so I want to emphasize, I think that risk is multi-dimensional, right? And it really speaks to some of the limitations, I would say, of strategic risk reduction as a concept, that in order to talk about risk reduction, you really have to talk about it at all levels, involving different kind of configurations of states by all actors. And ultimately, I think there's a need for a more risk-centric framing in nuclear policy at the national level, at the international level, in order to kind of move forward. And this is especially the case given some of these technological developments and new vulnerabilities. So I think, yeah, I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Anastasia, I'm going to give you the floor to comment on these issues as well, but we have another question on the JCPOA, the future of the JCPOA and the Iran proliferation situation. And to some extent, if we have a very comprehensive view of what may be the risks in a particular region that could lead to escalation, and if we take into account this idea that all states are responsible, no matter what is their status, on lowering risks, what could we or should we expect the P5 to also deal with this issue and to also put it on its agenda, this proliferation crisis situation?
Okay, then I will start with commenting the question about JCPOA, and then I will add a few follow-up comments to what Shatta and Wilfried have said. Of course, the future of JCPOA is a very significant factor, which I will connect to my thesis about the attitude of great powers to formal and non-formal international agreements. There are a lot of cases when states and political leaders treat the obligations or agreements reached by previous generation of political administrations very casually. And that is not a good signal to non-nuclear weapon states all over the world and to the international community in general. How can we talk about trust and long-term sustainable confidence building measures or risk reduction measures if there is now this habit of continuity in agreements? So yes, of course, support and restoration of JCPOA in the framework that was negotiated initially. That's a critical thing to do, because that will send a very clear, important message to everyone, and that will protect world order and arms control architecture as well from the further deterioration and erosion. Of course, bridging this question about JCPOA with a question about the potential role of non-nuclear weapon states. Of course, if we are talking about strategic risks, we cannot talk only about the relations between the P5. Strategic risks and global strategic stability is now understood not only as the prevention of nuclear war. That is also understood as the prevention of any global conflict, any global significant clash of conventional armed forces that may lead to uncontrolled, devastating consequences. So in this regard, of course, improvement of communication lines, establishment of various types of crisis reduction or deconflicting measures, channels, or procedures. That will be a good contribution. And here, I guess, much can be done from the side of non-nuclear weapon states. So the hubs of or nodes of geopolitical tensions, which we observe in different regions of the world, of course, include non-nuclear weapon states, and they may be proactive in first of all, carefully studying the experience of the Cold War and the deconflicting measures that were applied at the bilateral level between the USSR and USA. And then, secondly, they may suggest and present various types of new so-called creative solutions, because it's obvious that the security challenges of the 21st century need some creative solutions. We cannot mechanically repeat the formula and approaches and concepts of the 20th century. That simply will not work. So this adaptation of doctrines and security policies, of course, should involve non-nuclear weapon states as well. And maybe the last thing that I would like to add, following up Shata's comment, I see that we still are existing and talking to each other in these magic bubbles, and that the outreach is really important. But then when we are, as members of civil society, we are outreaching to the governmental authorities, I guess that is critical to give them enough time to digest all our initiatives and inputs and so on and so forth, because the bureaucratic procedures have their own inertia. And I fully support Shata's idea that there is always a lack of people and human and intellectual resources to work on all different issues. So I guess that at the level of NPT review process, NPT Review Conference, at the level of P5 Summit, we may expect only some declarations and symbolic acts which will establish the framework for future work. And that future steps will be much more critical. when the practical solutions, the practicalities will be discussed. And here, I guess, again, both non-nuclear weapon states and civil society may contribute to effective and successful work of the P5. So I do not think that all that measures that we are discussing must be limited within the P5 process and at the official level. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank Amélie de la Roche from the French Permanent Mission in Geneva, who is giving us a few official comments and reactions. First, to stress that, of course, strategic risk reduction is in the clear interest of the P5, that work is going to continue on this. She notices that the P5 will present its vision of strategic risk reduction in the next RevCon, which we hope is going to take place sooner than later. So it's going to be extremely interesting to follow this, how it is articulated, especially with the work of the EU, the CEND, Stockholm Initiative, UNIDIR. And another element that Amélie de la Roche is noting is the work the P5 member states are doing to identify concrete measures that could be implemented. So very useful remarks, also noticing, of course, that non-nuclear weapon states have to be and are included in the conversation in a practical manner, especially in the NPT context. I would like to close this, this very rich webinar with a kind of practical approach, practical question that Shata started to hint about. And it's the level of work and the amount of work we can put on the shoulders of the P5 on this matter, because of course, as we define strategic risk reduction in a very broad way, we may tend to add more issues and more topics on the agenda. As you mentioned, Chatapisha, the resources to address that and to work, and the number of meetings, the number of experts is also limited. So there was a question about the existing working groups. Is it wise to promote the creation of other working groups or the promotion of other topics? Or should we maybe focus on what is already on the agenda and try to reach concrete deliverables on this? So maybe a last word from each of you on this practical aspect and a very formal way the P5 can work on that. Chatapisha, you want to start?
Yeah, of course. So I guess I would just say that, of course, there are, inherent, there are limitations to the P5 process, and it cannot substitute kind of serious strategic discussions, bilateral discussions within the P5. It's not a panacea. However, it is the only process that exists where the P5 come together and speak and conduct these dialogues. I do worry that overloading the process will kind of break the kind of fragile nature of the discussions, and they won't be able to cope with adding more and more. However, I think strategic risk reduction is a natural addition and is already being addressed within the P5 process by the French, and it's a kind of natural extension of the work that's already being done. And like I mentioned in my remarks, risk reduction, strategic risk reduction is not a replacement for disarmament, but actually it should work. It should function in harmony and as a complement to efforts to reduce nuclear weapons risks and eliminate nuclear weapons in the longer term.
Thank you very much. Wilfred, you want to comment on that?
Sure, I'll be relatively quick. I mean, I think, yeah, that the topic is certainly quite important, and the P5 process is quite unique in terms of the format and the players. It's great that they've established these working groups, and I agree kind of the concern is rather than overloading them. It's to kind of progress, right? To see how these evolve. And on that note, it's quite heartening to see Amelie's contributions to the chat about the intention to intensify this dialogue, to get into kind of concrete risk reduction measures. And I think this is important on a couple of levels, both in and of itself, but also just kind of symbolically in terms of the commitments to issues of risk and risk reduction that can have follow-on effects, including at the bilateral or trilateral or whatever other processes. So thanks.
Thank you very much. Anastasia, you can have the last word on this.
Thank you, Emmanuelle. Just to add maybe a couple of things to what Shad and Wilfred already described comprehensively. I fully agree that the P5 should move at several levels, at the level of bilateral and trilateral and different combinations of official contacts and official discussions. And the second level, supporting 1.5 track discussions and continuous expert dialogue that will be focused on different aspects. So these P5 will not be able at the official level cover and address all the factors, but the network of expert meetings may work very attentively and accurately on each of the aspects, and then combine all that understandings and agreements into a more comprehensive approach. I would add two things that I guess P5 may succeed in doing some practical steps. Prevention of arms race in the out phase. That's where they definitely may do something visible and practical. There are different types of drafts and projects, so why not continue discussing them and moving forward in the direction of prevention of arms race in the outer space. And the last thing where, again, there are very good chances to not only demonstrate political will, but achieve significant sustainable results is prevention of incidents in cyber domain and prevention of escalating incidents in cyber domain in something offline, so to say, something that will lead to a serious political crisis that may result into exchange of strikes. Conventional strikes, at least that at least will be very scaring. Not to mention exchange of nuclear strikes, of course. So outer space and cyber deconflicting, that are two areas which I also would suggest to keep in mind when we map the way forward for P5 in the foreseeable future. That's all I think.
Thank you very much. I think from the discussion, from Amelie's comments in the chat, we can see that strategic risk reductions are now an established work stream for the P5, and clearly there is a demand and there is a need, of course, to continue to conduct expert work from the P5 on this, but also to present it to the public. And that's something that everybody emphasized here, and it will be looked at very carefully during the next RefCon. So we really hope to be able to have all the side events and presentations that are really in demand to better understand how it's been addressed in the recent months. I would like to thank all our panelists, all the audience for a very lively conversation. And once again, this webinar will be, we will all be able to rewatch it and share it with colleagues. So please feel free to come on our website very soon and once again, thank you very much for your participation and looking forward to other exchanges on these topics.